Please join me in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father and beloved Heavenly Mother, thank you so much that we are having this opportunity again. Today is Friday, and I'm really grateful that we can all join on today's Zoom webinar with Uncle William. And please let us gain a lot of inspiration and some new understanding and new learning, and please join us. And I offer this prayer in my name, Esther Strikoa from the Blessed Center family. Aju.
Thank you, Esther. Thank you very much. Okay, so good evening, everybody. Okay, so it's getting a bit complicated there at the end yesterday, this whole issue about language, but it's really important. So as I said, this is following this controversy. It goes all the way back to the Greeks. What's the relationship between a word and the real world in which we live? Is there some intrinsic meaning to words? Is there some real relationship, or is it just arbitrary? And so the Greeks said it was just arbitrary, but then that's one view. And then there's this big discussion with Wittgenstein, and then with Ferdinand de Saussure. So this is, and then Derrida, who I talked about. So this is the position now of the post-structuralists, who dominate a lot of the discourse and what goes on at universities and in culture today. So I'll just go back to this, which we looked at before, the end yesterday. Post-structuralists insist that words and texts have no fixed intrinsic meanings. So that means the meaning of a word and the meaning of a text is just arbitrary. Yeah, so that's important. It's arbitrary, and in that sense, every interpretation is as good as any other interpretation. So there's no fixed intrinsic meanings. That is, there's no transparent or self-evident relationship between them and either ideas or things. No basic or ultimate correspondence between language and the world. So certainly it is a problem. How does language relate to the world? So her conclusion is then, thus while language has been used to create binaries, so she would say then that all these binaries are artificial social constructs. The real world isn't really like that. It's all just arbitrary language in that sense, is completely arbitrary, such as male and female. Post-structuralist feminists see these binaries as artificial constructs, created to maintain the power of dominant groups. And so when we looked at Pythagoras, and so that's what she said, it's basically everything's arbitrary. And then I looked at this thing from little passage from Alice in Wonderland, where Humpty Dumpty says, when I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. In other words, I can arbitrarily decide what words mean. Of course, if you do that, it becomes a problem how to communicate. How can we communicate if people aren't using words in the same way? Even within Wittgenstein's idea of a language group, people within a particular community, they are able to communicate because the words have a particular meaning, the shared meaning between each other. They all agree on the meaning of a particular word. So he says, I can just choose these things arbitrarily. The question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. The question is, said Humpty Dumpty, which is to be master, that's all. So this idea here that question is then, who's to be master, that's all. In other words, and you see this going on a lot in the world today, people trying to change the discourse, trying to create a narrative, trying to force the language and the words to have a particular meaning that they want those words to have, which is different to the traditional meaning that those words have. There's a lot of that going on. And so, I don't know how many of you read this book by George Orwell called 1984, but if you want to understand what's going on in the world today, it's really a very, very good book to read. And so, fully recommend it. And so Orwell says in this book, he says, don't you see the whole aim of Newspeak? So this is a conversation that somebody called Winston is having with this other person, I can't remember his name now. Anyway, don't you see the whole aim of Newspeak is to narrow the range of thought? So Winston then, he's working as a kind of editor, going back and rewriting history and revising the history books so that the history books conform to what the party wants them to say. If you've lived in a communist country, you'll know that sort of stuff goes on. Marina's smiling away there. George Orwell, the reason why he understood the way that communists work is because he himself fought in the Spanish Civil War. He fought with the Republicans, with the Marxists. And so he got to understand Marxism, communism, socialism inside out. And he understood the way they work. Even though he himself was a socialist, that's why he joined that particular side, he became very, very hostile to communism because of the way in which they did things, including this idea of going back and rewriting history and changing the story to fit the way you think it ought to be today, to justify that what's going on today. A lot of people do that. Go around editing the text, airbrushing people out of photographs where they don't, because they've fallen out of favor. Anyway, so this is Winston, this is this person who's talking to Winston. So the person who's talking to him is like an important person in the party. Don't you see the whole aim of Newspeak is to narrow the range of thought? In the end, we shall make thought crime literally impossible because there'll be no words in which to express it. So at the moment, we have what's called political correctness. There's certain words and certain expressions you're no longer allowed to use. Certain parts of our vocabulary have been struck out. It's no longer politically correct to say those things. And if you write them on Facebook, you maybe lose your Facebook account. It's moving now in the world today to to thought crime, where there's certain things you're not even allowed to think. And if you think these things, you're regarded as having some kind of criminal tendency, being politically incorrect. So by removing a lot of these words, they're saying here, even thought crime will be impossible because there'll be no words in which to express it. Every concept that will ever be needed will be expressed by exactly one word, with its meaning rigidly defined, and with all its subsidiary meanings rubbed out and forgotten. The process will still be continuing long after you and I are dead. Every year, fewer and fewer words, and the range of consciousness always a little smaller. Even now, of course, there's no reason or excuse for committing thought crime. It's merely a question of self-discipline, reality control. But in the end, there won't even be any need for that. Has it ever occurred to you, Winston, that by the year 2050, at the very latest, not a single human being will be alive who could understand such a conversation as we're having now? So that's this, a lot of that sort of stuff is going on now. So what these people are rejecting, these post-structuralists, what they're reacting against and what they're rejecting is these binary opposites, which were tabulated by Pythagoras and which I've shown have permeated the whole of European culture, the whole of European society, where you have one side, one column dominating and oppressing the other column. And that's the experience of people throughout European history, trying to eliminate dissent, eliminate heretics, trying to push women down, trying to, straighten everything out. And it permeates the language in a way that Wittgenstein said, our language is permeated by myth. So the objection we have, or I have anyway, to these binary opposites is that first of all, they're all opposites. They're characterized as being in opposition to each other, which means there's an inherent conflict between them. Secondly, the other thing which is problematic is the fact that good and evil are included in these columns, so that one column, the A column, everything by association is regarded as being good, and the B column, everything by association is regarded as being bad. And so you have this idea, you're either one or the other. And so you can see a lot of the conversations going on in the political world today have also become extreme. Either you're on our side or you're on the other side, and we have to eliminate thoughts with which we disagree. We have to eliminate political opinions which we think are wrong, usually by denigrating the people who are saying those things and saying they're all racist or they're fascist or they're all stupid. Yeah, that sort of thing, that kind of language goes on a lot, where you have one column trying to dominate the other and trying to stop those people being able to open their mouths and express their opinions. So this is the problem then, the binary opposites. And as we've seen, they permeate the whole of European culture. And it's becoming particularly extreme in the world today, that the polarization of political opinions, the polarization of political views, and the extremes that you find in the political discourse today. And you can see that going on today at the moment with what's going on in America. Again, you can see a very extreme kind of discourse. So what we need then, if we recognize Pythagoras is wrong, the post-structuralists said we want to get rid of binaries because binaries are inherently oppressive. But I would say what we really need is not to get rid of binaries. What we need is a new ontology. Yeah. So when we look at Pythagoras, we can say that Pythagoras' description of the world as he saw it was the description of the corrupted world, a world of patriarchy, a world of conflict, a world of zero-sum game, either you win or I win, a world of oppression where one side tries to eliminate the other. That was his experience. This is the way the world was. That's the way the world of the fall. So what Pythagoras was describing was fallen society, and you can say, yep, his description of the way society was and the way the world was quite accurate in that sense. It's an accurate description of the fallen world. And then it no longer is just a description of the fallen world, it then becomes a myth that supports the status quo. So the status quo, this is the existing state of affairs, particularly with regard to social political issues. And so Pythagoras' table, or these two columns, that was like a myth which supported the status quo, which again has gone on for thousands of years in Europe. And finally has been exposed only in the last few years, particularly by feminists who find the situation intolerable, naturally. So it basically, this Pythagoras thing is what's called the is-ought problem of David Hume. So David Hume said, just because this is the way it is, doesn't mean this is the way it ought to be. But with Pythagoras and the myth supporting status quo, this is the way it is, and this is the way it ought to be. So we see this not just with Pythagoras, but we also saw it when we looked at India with a caste system, supported by the theory of reincarnation or the myth of reincarnation. We saw it with Plato, the myth of the noble lie, to try to persuade people that the way things are is the way things are supposed to be. We saw with feudalism, again, a hierarchical society like a pyramid. This is the way things are, this is the way things are supposed to be. And so Pythagoras' view, which has permeated the whole of our language, as I said, in terms of positive is good, negative is bad. Our whole language has been permeated by this myth, and it supports the status quo in ways we cannot even imagine. So David Hume, who's a skeptic, my favorite philosopher, by the way, he said, actually, just because it is like this, it doesn't mean it ought to be like this. Yes, this is the way it is, but you can't say because this is the way it is, this is the way it ought to be. Yeah. And so this then is a challenge that of Abraham. When Abraham saw the burning palace, talked about this yesterday, the different ways in which you can respond to this. And Abraham's response was, God is real, God is good, God is loving, God cares, and there's only one God, not two gods. Yeah, no, he wouldn't accept dualism, only one God. But at the same time, his own experience of life was a huge amount of injustice. And so his determination then was, I'm going to deal with the evil that I find in the world. I'm going to address the injustice that I find in the world. This is the way the world is, but this isn't the way the world ought to be. The way the world can be different to the way that it is. Yeah, so that's why from Abraham then, we had this huge rebellion against the fallen status quo, a huge rebellion to try and change the world and to make the world different to the way that it is. Looking to the future and the idea here of establishing a kingdom of heaven, a God-centered families, and a God-centered society. So Abraham then was really a revolutionary in his conception of the nature of reality, his analysis of the problems of humankind, and the recognition that evil is a mistake. It doesn't need to be like this. It doesn't need to be like this. It shouldn't be like this. And it's possible to change things and restore things and to make things different. And then you have from Abraham, you have this whole history from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, children of Jacob, Moses, Jesus, and a gradual expansion of God's providence from the individual onto the worldwide level, and the gradual elimination of oppression, the gradual elimination of injustice, and gradually creating a liberal democratic society where people have the freedom to fulfill the three great blessings. Okay, so what comes next? So then the question is then, okay, we need a new ontology. So what then is the nature of reality? So Abraham said, God created man in his image and likeness, male and female, he created them. So that was this new ontology. Reality is in pairs. And so in the principle then, which is a new expression of the truth, it's a new expression of the old truth, which is first revealed by Abraham. It says every entity, as you know, I'm sure you've read it 1,000 times, every entity possesses dual characteristics of yang, masculinity, and yin, femininity. And everything requires for its existence a reciprocal relationship between the dual characteristics of yang and yin. So yes, there are binaries, masculinity and femininity, yin and yang. But the point is that these are they exist in a reciprocal relationship. So that means they're not opposites. They're reciprocal. So it's not a table of opposites, but a table of reciprocal, which means they're corresponding, they're matching, they're complementary, they're equivalent, they're mutual. Yeah, they're mutually attractive and complementary, and they have equal value. So you can't say one is good, one is bad. They have equal value, they complement each other, they're attracted towards each other, and they're equivalent in value. So that's a really important, a complete, very, very different to Pythagoras' view of the nature of reality. And the important thing here is you can't have one without the other. So instead of, as on Pythagoras' table, one tries to eliminate the other, with dual characteristics, you cannot have one without the other. They need each other, they're complementary. So this is this table that you've seen 1,000 times. Particles are either positive or negative. When particles combine together, they form an atom. Atoms have a valency. The atoms combine together, they form molecules. More complex molecules combine together, they form organic matter. And then you have plants, and then you have animals, which are male or female, and human beings, which are man or woman. So the principle says every entity has dual characteristics. So the question is this true? Is this proposition true? Does this proposition correspond with reality? Is it true? Is this the way things are? It's very easy to prove this wrong. If you can come up with an entity which doesn't have dual characteristics, then you'll have proved the principal understanding and description of the nature of reality to be false or incomplete or not accurate. And is it coherent? Does it all fit together? Is it logical? So I personally, I've thought about this. Whenever I'm teaching, I always ask people, can you prove it wrong? For me, when I read things, just because I read it doesn't mean I think it's right. I'm always trying to prove things wrong. If you can't prove something's wrong, it's probably right. That's a good scientific method called falsifiability. If you can falsify something, prove it wrong, then it's wrong. So, in the olden days, dictionaries, if you looked up what a swan is, and you looked up in a dictionary what a swan is, it'll say it's a white bird with a long neck. And that was the definition of what a swan is. Nobody ever come across a swan which wasn't white, unless it was a young gosling, and didn't have a long neck. Until one day somebody went off to Australia and they found black swans. And then, this proves that the definition of swan is wrong. So they had to change the definition of swan. Okay, so that's how you disprove something. You find something which shows it's not correct. Anyway, I haven't managed to find anything myself. So the other important thing here in this diagram, there is no good and evil. It's just a description of the nature of reality. So there's no moral overlay for positive and negative or masculine and feminine. Yeah, and some of you may know when you teach guests, sometimes they get upset. Sometimes the women get upset because negative is on this side. And of course, they're thinking that means women are evil because that's built into the language, yeah? But actually, in the principal understanding, this is just a neutral description of the nature of reality. It's not that one is better than the other. They're just different, and they're complementary, and they're mutually attractive. Okay, so the next sentence, it says in the principle, a thing comes into existence when these dual characteristics are formed reciprocal relationships, both within the thing and between it and other things. So if you look at an atom here, you can see, oh, this is an atom. In the middle here, it's got a nucleus made up of protons and neutrons, and whizzing around the outside or in standing waves there are electrons. Yeah? And so you can't have an atom. An atom doesn't exist unless there are protons and electrons. Yeah? If there was just protons, there'd be no atoms. If there were just electrons, there'd be no atoms. In the same way with the human species, if there were just men, then very soon the human species would disappear. If there were just women, very soon the human species would disappear. Yeah? In order for the species of any species to exist, it has to be masculine and feminine entities, otherwise the species cannot exist. So it says here, in order for something to exist, it has to have dual characteristics and a reciprocal relationship, both within the thing and between it and other things. So here you can see a water molecule. There's 2 hydrogen atoms here, and each hydrogen atom has 1 electron, and this is an oxygen atom which has got 6 electrons, and it's got a bit of space in its shell there for another atom, for another electron, and hydrogen atoms a bit of space in their shell for another electron there. So it combines together to form a very stable molecule, water. So when we read the divine principle, you get these kind of abstract sentences, and you have to think, well, is this really true? Does this correspond to reality? So when you actually look at reality as expressed through modern science, atomic physics, you can say, yes, that's the way it is. So I would say, yes, this statement in principle is true. So that's what we have to do. You have to every sentence in the divine principle, you can unpack basically into a book often. So, and then this is another way of looking at this principle of yin and yang, is everything has a inside and outside. You can't have an inside without an outside. You can't have a front without a back. You can't have high without low. You can't have convex without concave. Yeah, you can't have one without the other, and one can't sort of try and eliminate the other. Just the way things are. So good and evil, then, they don't fit into this dual characteristics, because good and evil are not like positive and negative. First of all, they're not complementary. Good and evil aren't attracted to each other. Good people and evil people generally are not attracted to each other. They feel very uncomfortable in each other's presence. They repel each other. And when they meet, there's often conflict. And it is desirable and possible to have good without evil. When God created the world, God created good. It's possible to have good without evil. And we can appreciate the good without knowing evil. We can appreciate good things without knowing evil. So I can imagine everybody here likes to eat and would like to go and eat in a nice restaurant. I know it's not possible these days because we're all locked down and all the restaurants are closed. At least in London they are, but I guess many other places. But anyway, most people would like to go and eat nice food in a nice restaurant in a nice kind of environment. And we feel good eating together with our family and our friends. We can appreciate good food. We can appreciate good company. We can appreciate a good, nice environment. And in order to do that, we don't need evil. Now, can you imagine? Sometimes people say, well, you can't appreciate good without knowing evil. So imagine then you've sat down, you go into this restaurant, you sat down, you ordered your food from the waiter, and the order's gone to the kitchen. And then the waiter brings all your meals, and you sit down, you're sitting down, the food is delivered, and you say grace, you say a prayer, and you're just about to pick up your knife and fork to eat, when suddenly the pictures on the wall change. So instead of having beautiful pictures on the wall, suddenly the pictures all change, and instead there are photographs of little children starving, and you can see all their rib cage. And you look at these children and other people who are obviously starving and malnourished, and what do you do? Does that put you off your food? Or does that enable you to enjoy your food better? Oh, I'm so lucky, I've got such nice food here. I can really appreciate this food because I know that in another part of the world, there are people who are starving. and malnourished. It doesn't work like that, does it? Yeah, the evil destroys the good. It spoils it. So good and evil then are not woven into the fabric of the universe. You don't need evil to appreciate the good. So dualism then, as the principle says, is false. And there's a better explanation. The better explanation is God is good, evil is a mistake, and we can get rid of evil and we can make a world of goodness. So what is the biblical view then? It says, as you know, in the Bible, in Genesis, God did not create good or evil. He created the world and says it is good. Yeah. So good and evil then are not things. You can't say, oh, this is good. Show me a good, or show me an evil. Good and evil are judgments, they're descriptions. Yeah. They don't exist, they don't have an existence in their own right. So that's contrary to what Plato said, because Plato said the good exists in some platonic heaven. It has some kind of, these abstract nouns have some kind of real existence in some kind of platonic heaven, and somebody's able to peer into these heavens and figure out what it is, mostly philosophers. But the biblical view is that good and evil aren't like that. They don't exist. They're adjectives, not nouns. So good and evil then, we talk about good and evil, they're judgment about certain kinds of actions or certain states of affairs. So we say something is good or we say something is bad, depending upon what the consequences are. So actions that lead to people getting hurt, we say this category of actions we call evil actions. Categories of actions which lead to people's well-being and to good things happening, we say this category of actions we say are good. So good and evil then, they're judgments. This is good, that is bad, but they don't exist in their own right. Any more than beauty exists in its own right. You can show me beauty. I can show you a beautiful painting. I can show you a beautiful flower. I can show you a beautiful garden. I can show you a beautiful person, but I cannot show you beauty. Again, that's contrary to Plato, who thought that beauty has some independent existence as an abstract noun in this platonic heaven. And it's the same with truth. I can't show you truth. I can show you, I can say this statement is true. That statement is true. Yeah, and so in that sense, it's the truth because it's a value judgment I made. So laws then, so that's why there are laws in the Bible of things that people shouldn't do. Murder, steal, commit adultery. They're to prevent people getting hurt and hurting themselves. So that's an important point there. When you do something wrong, you're not only hurting somebody else, you're actually damaging and hurting yourself. So what to do in the Bible, what to do is very general. It's to love God, love your neighbor, love a stranger, be kind. In other words, be responsible. So there's no such thing as the good thing to do. That's why God said to Adam and Eve, eat of any of the trees except one. There are many ways in which you can be good. There are a huge range of activities, a myriad of activities and things you can do which are good activities and good things to do. There's not one good thing to do which everybody should conform to, which is basically follows on from Platon's view of the world. There's only one good way in which the state should be arranged. There's only one good way in which this should be done or that should be done. Actually, there are many different ways which are good. There's only a few things which lead to harm, damage, and there are laws against that. Those few things there. Just like God said, don't eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. If you do, you're going to die, come to a nasty end. Instead, you can eat from all the other ones, though. So if we look what it says in the Divine Principle book, what is good and evil? It says here, an act or the result of an act is considered good when it fulfills God's purpose of creation. Okay, so again, it's a judgment. An act is that is a good act. Yeah, that because the result is good. Considered good because it leads to fulfillment of God's purpose of creation. So again, it's a judgment. This is a good act, that is a bad act. This takes place when subject partner and object partner unite through harmonious and spirited give and take of love and beauty and become the third object partner to God form the four-position foundation, which are three blessings. And then it says, on the other hand, an act or its result is called evil. So again, it's a judgment. That's an evil act. So evil is an adjective. When it violates God's purpose of creation by forming a four-position foundation under the dominion of Satan. Okay, so we regard, some actions are good and some actions are bad. In the world in which we're living today, people often think good and evil are just a matter of opinion. It's all relative. There's no such, you can't say that's wrong. You can't say that's right. It's just a matter of opinion. You think it's right, I think it's wrong, and that's it. So the question is then, is there a universal absolute standard of right and wrong? This is, question. Is there something we can say is a universal standards of morality? Well, based upon this, how can we get from this very abstract statement here in the divine principle to something which relates to the real world in which we live? Yeah. Okay, so it says here, evil acts violates God's purpose of creation by forming a four-position foundation under the dominion of Satan. It's terribly abstract. So let's think about what are the three worst crimes? Well, normally I ask people to reply, but you're all sort of muted, so I'll just go and tell you anyway. So, okay, try and imagine what's the worst thing that could possibly happen to you. The worst thing that could possibly happen to you is getting murdered. Yeah. I think everybody universally would admit, I don't want to be murdered. There are even murderers. They don't mind. They say, I don't mind murdering somebody else, but I don't want someone to come and murder me. So in that sense, you can go around, you can ask every single human being in the world, would you like to be murdered? Would you mind if I murder you? And of course, everybody will say no, unless they're completely psychotic in some way, mentally deranged. So what happens when you're murdered? If you're murdered, you cannot fulfill the first blessing. Why can't you fulfill the first blessing? Well, because your body's in the ground and your mind or your spirit is in the spiritual world. So a complete separation of mind and body. So murder then prevents, getting murdered, getting killed, prevents the person from fulfilling the first blessing. So that's why we say it's wrong. It's a wrong act. Okay, so everybody can agree, okay, murder's absolutely wrong. Yeah, I agree with that. Okay, so that's like an absolute standard of wrongness. Okay, what about getting beaten up? Would you mind if I beat you up? No, thank you. Okay, well, we can say violence generally is wrong. And gradually you can work your way from this sort of basement standard of what is moral and what is immoral. Murder is immoral, violence is immoral, wrong. And you can gradually work your way up. Well, generally also hurting people is wrong. So that's why Father said, violation of the heart. If you hurt somebody, it's wrong. Yeah, you shouldn't hurt people. Okay, hurt people is wrong. Okay, let's think about, well, okay, so we can get that. So what about the second worst, or another terrible crime? I think, again, every human being, generally, I think, would say, no, I regard rape as the worst thing. Even if you ask the rapist, there are rapists around, but they don't want to be raped themselves. Yeah. So rape then, especially, women obviously, as you know, are the main victims of rape, is the worst thing that can happen to a woman, but also a terrible thing to happen to a man as well, because it damages the whole of your inside. And when people experience being raped, then they have a complete loss of self-worth. They feel like they're worthless, a loss of self-esteem, it's like incredibly devastating for a person, and it's very, very difficult for somebody to recover from that kind of experience. And so we would say then that makes it very, very hard, if not impossible, to fulfill the second blessing. So when a person's raped, they become incredibly badly damaged. And then it becomes very, very hard to trust somebody. It becomes very, very hard to love somebody, very, very, very hard to receive love. And so when a person has been raped, then having a sexual relationship, a loving sexual relationship with somebody else becomes really difficult, because all the memories come back. And so it becomes very, very hard to form a loving, trusting relationship with one's husband or wife. So it corrupts and damages a conjugal relationship. Because the conjugal relationship then becomes damaged, it's very hard to wholeheartedly give yourself to somebody else. Then this affects the relationship between the husband and wife. That then affects the relationship between parents and children. And all kinds of fears and all kinds of stuff gets passed on to the next generation. And so that's why Father talks about it being a violation of lineage, it then brings a stain, or it damages the lineage when that sort of thing happens, because the man or the woman becomes damaged, and that damage easily affects the relationship with their spouse, and that damage then goes on to affect their relationship with their children and grandchildren. And as you know, people who are sexually abused, then as children, very easily go on to become sexual abusers themselves. And that's a huge problem. So again, everybody can agree, yep, this is like an absolute standard of evil is murder and rape. It's not relative, it's absolute and universal. And then next one is robbery. Nobody wants to be robbed. Nobody wants someone to break into their house and steal their jewelry, if they have any, or steal their car, or steal their bicycle, or steal their business. Yeah, nobody wants that. Because the third blessing is to become a true owner. How can you become an owner if somebody steals your property? You can't do it. So again, robbery prevents people from realizing the third blessing. So that's why theft, stealing, robbery is all wrong, because it prevents people from realizing the third blessing. So that's why I say this whole category of activities, actions, fraud, pyramid schemes, all these kinds of things, are all evil because they prevent people from realizing the third blessing. So Father talked about this in violation of public property, but essentially it's a violation of anybody's property, not just public property, but anything that belongs to somebody else. And so, this then, three most important laws any country can have: law against murder, law against rape, law against robbery. The real problem comes when the state starts going around murdering people, and armies, often when they invade another country, the soldiers go around raping people and robbing people, and that's really hell on earth. Hell. Okay, so we can say there's an absolute standard of evilness, and so from that you can start to build up. Okay, where do we get to where a whole range of activities is good? So we can't say there's an absolute standard of goodness in that sense that everybody has to conform to. That's too abstract, because there are many different goods, but there is an absolute standard of evilness and wrongness, which is much easier to talk to people about. And as I said, it's really got nothing to do with God in that sense at all. This is something everybody can agree with, whether they believe in God or an atheist. So the whole purpose of religion then is to help people to fulfill and protect these three desires that people have: to live, to have a family, and to own. So again, a little bit more from the divine principle. Good and evil are also a matter of consequences. Good and evil action may take the same form. Their true nature may be discerned through their fruits. Then yield their fruits accordance with the divergent purposes they pursue. So for example, if you saw a photograph or a picture of a man and woman engaged in a sexual act, how can you tell if it's a good or an evil action? Well, one may be between a husband and wife, because they love each other and they want to express their love for each other, maybe with a hope of having a child. The other may be a man raping a woman. But the act looks the same, it has the same form. But the true nature is only discerned through the fruits. What is the fruit of the relationship between husband and wife? It's joy and happiness, and maybe a child. What is the fruit of the relationship of rape? Totally different, totally damaging, destructive. So they yield their fruits in accordance with the divergent purposes they pursue. So the purpose of sexual act between a husband and wife and rape is completely different. So again, it's about consequences, and it's really important to remember that. So and the other thing is, a good motivation then is not a justification. Sometimes people say, well, I did it with a good motivation, therefore it must be okay. But actually, we decide if something is good or bad depending upon the fruits. In other words, depending upon the consequences. So as there's a common English expression, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. When I lived in Russia for 7 years, I met many people quite a few elderly people who are communists. And some of them became very good friends. They're very sincere and very genuine and very good people. But at the same time, communists in Russia had committed terrible atrocities. But when you find out, you find a lot of these people, they did it with a good motivation. Yeah. The consequences are horrendous, but often they thought they were doing the right thing. Yeah. So we have to be very, very careful then about this. And so that's why there's that's why there are laws. It's the action, not the person as evil. So a certain category of actions, murder, rape, robbery, all these laws which shouldn't be violated. You may have the best will in the world, but it's still wrong. A classic story in Dostoevsky, the what's it called? Not the Brothers Karamazov. Which one is it? Irina, with Crime and Punishment. That's right, Crime and Punishment, where there's this very idealistic student, and he's living with this old lady, and she's incredibly rich and incredibly wealthy, but she has no family, she has no friends, but she's just got all this money. So he's an incredibly idealistic student. He thinks, actually, if I kill her, nobody will miss her, but I can take all the money and I can do lots of good actions and lots of good deeds with it. Yeah, I have a good motivation. Yeah, but that's still wrong. Of course, that was Dostoevsky was analyzing what the Bolsheviks were thinking. Yeah, a lot of them good motivation, but because they broke the law, the consequences are wrong. So these laws are there for a purpose. You might think, I'm going to go and rob a bank and use all the money for God's will. It's still wrong. So it's the action that is wrong and shouldn't be, just because you got a good motivation, it's not a justification for violating the moral law. So the road to hell is paved with good intentions. The other thing is the action which is designated as being evil, not the person. So you love the sinner, the person does something wrong, but you don't love what they do wrong. Yeah. So it's a very basic Christian idea. It's not the person that's evil, it's the action they do that is evil. So as I said, there are many ways of being good and doing good. Okay, so that's a little bit of that. A little bit of a sort of, now we'll go back onto the main part of the principle. It says every entity possesses dual characteristics. So even though atoms become positive or negative ions after ionization, each still consists of a positive nucleus and negative electrons in stable unity. Okay. Similarly, each animal, whether male or female, maintains its life through reciprocal relationships of yang and yin elements within itself. And the same holds true for every plant. In people, a feminine nature is found latent in men, and a masculine nature is found latent in women. So it's very important. The principle then recognizes men aren't pure masculinity and women aren't pure femininity, but actually within every man there's a feminine aspect, and within every woman a masculine aspect. And the psychoanalyst Carl Jung, he analyzes quite a lot. He talked about an anima and an animus. There's this masculine aspect in women and feminine aspect in men. And sometimes it's quite small and sometimes it's bigger, but it varies. And so that's why I have this yin and yang symbol like that. So again, you can see this is very different to Pythagoras's view of the table of opposites. Here you can see this intermingling. It's not pure one thing or pure the other thing, but actually there is this intermingling, and almost like a spectrum, you might say. Okay, so if you want to go into deeper symmetries, then again a bit, this, all particles then, they're either bosons, like protons and neutrons, they're bosons. And sometimes say, well, okay, neutrons, they don't have positivity or negativity. They don't have dual characteristics. But if you look at bosons, they're all made up of quarks. And so quarks themselves exist in pairs, an up and down quark, charmed and strange quarks, and top and bottom quark. I'm not going to say any more because I don't know enough about it. And every boson then it has, I think, 3 of these in some kind of combination. They each have a third of a charge or something. And leptons, such as electrons, they also exist in pairs as well, and matter and antimatter. So anyway, that's not really what I want to talk about. The question is then, So we're looking here for a new ontology. So the old ontology of Pythagoras, it doesn't really fit reality, and it's been rejected, this idea of table of opposites. So the question is this ontology true? Is this an accurate and correct description of the nature of reality? Yeah. And so it's very important when we're coming on to address issues around identity and especially around gender politics, what kind of binaries are we talking about? Okay, when we're talking about this, what kind of binaries are we talking about? Are these categories arbitrary? So the question is then, well, is positive and negative? Is this arbitrary? Is it really the case that protons and electrons have a different charge, and that actually they have an identical charge, as one is positive and one is negative? Is that really the way that it is, or is that just arbitrary? Is it really the case that animals, male or female, is that arbitrary, or is it really like that? And so conservatives, radicals, feminists, post-structurists, are all trapped within the Pythagorean, Hegelian, or Marxist paradigm. They can't escape from it. So we looked at that yesterday. We saw how the linguists like Saussure are all stuck within this paradigm. Hegel obviously is, Marxists are, the structuralists, the post-structurists, they're all trapped within this paradigm of binary opposites. And conservatives are as well. They're no different. So the point is that when we engage in any kind of conversation, we need to emphasize and explain, actually, we're not operating from the basic assumptions of the nature of reality, that there are binary opposites. We don't accept binary opposites. Binary opposites is a false description of the nature of reality. That is not the way the world is. We don't accept that description of the nature of reality, that there are binary opposites and one is oppressing and dominating the other. Our understanding of the nature of reality is something quite different, dual characteristics. So there are binaries, but what we reject is binary opposites. Yeah, the binaries are dual characteristics. That's what we call binaries. We accept, when people say, so we're not reactionaries trying to defend the A side against the B side. We're not revolutionaries or radicals trying to overthrow the A side by emphasizing the B side. We don't fit into that kind of paradigm. The arguments today, people are either advocating the A side, the male patriarchy side, the conservative reactionary side, or they're advocating the radical side, which is the B column, but we don't fit into that. And I think we need to be very clear. We're talking about binary pairs which are complementary and have equal value. So it's very hard not to get drawn into the conversation, taking one side or the other. But we don't want to be in that conversation. So when we're talking about these binaries, dual characteristics, we say that one is subject and one is object. But it's really important to recognize here that when we're talking about subject and object relationships, we're not talking about an oppressor and oppressed. Yeah. So the binary opposites, one side is oppressing the other side. Yeah. That's just locked into that kind of paradigm, that dynamic. We're not talking about an oppressor and oppressed. We're not talking about dominant and submissive, which is Derrida's criticism of the whole structuralist position. We're talking about something very different. So as it says in the Divine Principle, it says in the relationship between a man and a woman, the man is a subject partner giving love, while the woman is the object partner returning beauty. It says here the subject partner is the one giving love. Not the subject partner is the one who's controlling. Not the subject partner is the one who's giving out orders. Not the subject partner who's organizing everything. Not the subject partner who's more important than everybody else. The subject partner is the one giving love. That's what it says. So very often when we read about subject and object, we often read into what it says in the principle our own basic assumptions. And this is a huge problem. That often when people read the principle, they're reading into the principle the assumptions that they've inherited from their cultural background. Very often people do that. Whereas the principle then is saying, man is a subject partner giving love, caring. The woman is the object partner returning beauty. And so, of course, if you love someone, if a man loves a woman feels good on the inside. When she feels good on the inside, she feels happy. When she feels happy, she starts radiating beauty, and becoming even more attractive. Yes. So when a woman receives love, she becomes beautiful, starts radiating, And that's that kind of relationship, subject and object relationship. It's not about dominant and submissive, it's about love and beauty, love and respect. And as it goes on to say in the principle, however, when the subject partner and object partner become completely one in harmony, love is found within beauty and beauty is found within love. So this person who is loving you looks very beautiful, as well as etc., etc. So it becomes like that. Love is beautiful and beauty is love. And this is because when a subject partner and object partner become one in a circular movement, the subject partner sometimes acts as the object partner, and the object partner sometimes acts as a subject partner. And then it becomes like a conversation, yeah, where one person starts the conversation on one topic, and then after a while another person, and it starts a conversation, another topic. And it's a conversation, talking, listening, giving, receiving. And that's what it is, love and beauty. So that's what the relationship is between the dual characteristics of subject and object. It's not one is trying to oppress or get rid of the other, because you can't, as Father said, you can't be a subject unless there are objects. You can't be an object unless there's a subject. Just like you can't be a leader unless people are following you. You may think you're a leader, but if nobody's actually following you, you're not a leader. And so, as it says here, you have this relationship of love and beauty. They're both masculine and feminine expressions of the divine. So that's the insight from the Bible. God created man and woman in his image and likeness. So men and women are both expressions of the divine. Yeah, not just man, which is the ancient worldview, but masculinity and femininity, each are equal expressions of the divinity of divine. So again, it's not a violent hierarchy, which again was the critique of Pythagoras, but a circular harmony based on love, with which people can exchange their positions. So sometimes a man will initiate the relationship, sometimes a woman will initiate the relationship, and through this love, then they're united and they create a higher level of existence. So then they become a couple, a couple together. So two individuals go into a church, they go through a ritual, a ceremony with a priest. The priest pronounces them husband and wife, and they leave the church not as two individuals, but as a couple. On the outside, they look the same, but the relationship between them has been transformed into a different ontological reality. They now become a couple. And so the question is then, this view, I would say, the principal view of the nature reality, it fits better with the scientific view of masculinity and femininity as well. So when scientists, psychologists and people, they study masculinity and femininity, then this view, the principal view, is much more accurate than Pythagoras' view. So going back, sometimes people say, well, what about an amoeba? So if you go back to the building blocks of life, we find that every single living creature, even if it's asexual, like an amoeba, is made up of, has in its nucleus chromosomes, and these chromosomes are made up of DNA. And DNA is the building block of life. As DNA, it's called a double helix. So there's two strands which are wrapped together, and they're formed, and between these two strands they're called base pairs. These four different molecules here which exist in pairs. So you can see here, even if you go down to the most basic level of life, you can see dual characteristics, and base pairs. This is just the way the world is. And there's not three, it's not a triple DNA, it's a double helix. And so when they replicate, this is called semi-conservative DNA replication. I don't know what fully conservative or left-wing DNA replication is like, but anyway, you have the DNA and the strands unravel. So that one unravels like that, and this one here unravels like that. And then another one is formed around it. So what is created new, what this is like, and what that is like, is exactly the same as what that was like before. It replicates itself. The old parent unravels, and then two new daughters come along, and that's the way it works. So then when we look at human beings, you can see human beings, we have chromosomes like all animals do and all living things do. And we have 22 pairs of chromosomes, which are all identical to each other, I think. And then there's also one pair of sex chromosomes, which is X and Y. So what are these sex chromosomes? Well, that is that Oh, okay, I'm going to stop here because I should have stopped there, actually, because I'm looking at the time here. It's 10 to 7, so I should stop. Okay, so thank you so far, and I'll unshare my screen. So what I'm moving on now towards is in the direction of gender issues. And, you know, part of the whole issue that people are bringing up with gender politics is this whole reaction against binaries. People saying, I'm non-binary. So when people say I'm non-binary, you have to think, well, what are they saying? What are they meaning here? So we want to have a look and see what is the nature of reality. Then we can start to understand what's going on in the modern conversations about gender issues. So as I said, you know, whether we like it or not, this is the nature of reality. It's just the way things are. Everything is built up of, all living things are built up of DNA. And whether we like it or not, human chromosomes are like this. Everybody has these 22 pairs of chromosomes and 1 pair of sex chromosomes. And so whether we like it or not, either women have 2 X chromosomes and men have 1 X and 1 Y. So it's not a spectrum, either one or the other. There's a tiny, tiny proportion of the population, fraction of less than, well under, you know, maybe 0.01% or something, when they have some chromosomal abnormality which doesn't fit into either XX or XY. So the reality is that people's sex, either you're male or you're female. And at the end of the day, you can't change that. When people say they want to change sex, you can't change sex because you can't change your chromosomes. You might be able to do some cosmetic surgery on the outside, but you can't actually change your sex chromosomes. That's just fixed. So how's the sex of a baby decided? Well, you have the father got X and Y and mother X and X, and you know, you either end up with an X and a Y or an X and an X. I personally find this whole thing problematic. I think it's really unfair. Why have women got more DNA than men? And you know, that's just a reality. That's just the way it is. And you know, this whole coronavirus thing going around and finding that men are more likely to die. 60% of the people who die from coronavirus are men, and 40% are women, something like that. And you think, well, that's discrimination. That's not fair. And apparently, that's because the immune system is affected by this. Because the women got an extra bit of DNA, it means their immune system works better or something. So that's just the way it is. And you might wonder, well, is there any difference physiologically between men and women? Obviously, apart from the outside where this, you know, looks different. So scans done on male and female brains reveal this. An average, typical, no, not all like this, not all like that, a typical male brain, more connections run between back and front, which may account for their better spatial skills and motor muscle control in men. So men don't mind reverse parking cars as much as women do. Women, typical female brain, more neural connections go from left to right, from the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere, which could account for women's better verbal skills and intuitive abilities. Okay, so you might wonder, well, okay, this is what it looks like on the outside, but does it actually affect what's going on the inside? So again, one of the dual characteristics, which I haven't looked at at all, is the idea of Sung Sang and Hyung Sang, or inner aspect and outer aspect, and one is an expression of the other. So if on the outside, the outer expressions like this, does that affect the way the inner expression is? Is there a difference? So there's some funny cartoons like this. This is quite amusing. This is a man's day, and this is a woman's day. And, you know, when our sons used to come home from school, my wife would always say, "How was your day?" And they'd always say, "Fine," and they'd go and play with their toys. When my daughter came home from school, my wife would say, "How's your day?" And you got a long story about all the ups and downs, and this person said that, and that person said this, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously a much more interesting internal life going on there, much richer. And again, 2 boys, young guys wearing the same shirt, were brothers. 2 girls with the same shirt, not happy. And you read about this. The celebrities, when they go into a big meeting of other celebrities, the women scan the floor. They see another woman wearing the same dress as she is wearing. She goes straight up to her bedroom and changes. And again, this is something I find incredibly unfair. When I go into a department store, I find that there's at least the whole of the ground floor is entirely for women's clothes. Now, if a man wants to go and buy some clothes in a department store, he has to go down into the basement and he might find a little corner there with a few men's clothes. Whereas the women's clothes, there's a huge amount of variety. And I think that's so unfair. I think there should be equality of space allocated to clothing in shops. But I don't think that's going to become a law. Again, these are all funny, amusing, but they reveal something about the differences between men and women. And that's the way it is in our household. 2 weeks before we go on holiday, I have to get my wife and my daughter's suitcases out of the garage so they can pack. And for me, it's just the morning before. So also different things going on inside these brains. The female brain is full of all these kind of thoughts, and the male brain is full of all these kind of thoughts. They have very, very different interests. It's just a statistical thing. It's just a bit of an exaggeration. But, there are scientists who study these things, and they say there are substantial differences. For example, men and women don't see in the same way. I realized this when I was a child. My parents went to a party and they came home from the party, and the following morning over breakfast, they were talking about the party. And my mother asked my dad, how was the party for you? And my dad talked about the person who he was talking to and the conversation that he had. And my mother said, and did you notice those two people talking to each other? And my dad said, no. And my mother said, did you see what kind of wallpaper they had? And my dad said, no. And my mother said, did you see what kind of shoes she was wearing? And my dad said, no. And I thought there's something wrong with my dad's eyesight. But then the fact is, many, many decades later, I realized the problem with my dad, he was just a man. Because women's eyesight and men's eyesight is actually different. Men find it much easier to drive at night than women do, because men basically have a sort of tunnel vision. What a man is looking at is what the man is seeing. Whereas a woman's eyesight is actually different. They get information comes in from all different directions. And so for a woman, it's much more difficult to drive at night because the headlights are very, very disturbing. She can't just ignore them like a man can. And so at a very, very basic physiological level, there's difference between men and women. Just in terms of eyesight. And it's not just that, but there are many, many differences in terms of physical physiology, which means many, many differences in what's going on the inside. So again, female babies like faces, male babies prefer moving objects. Not all of them are like this, but generally speaking, female babies prefer faces, male babies moving objects. Anybody who's been to a primary school, you'll see that groups of boys play differently than groups of girls. Mothers and fathers don't interact with their kids in the same way. Women hear better than men. Men are more consistent than women. Women can verbally express their emotions better than men. Men are attracted to youth and beauty. Women are attracted to status. It is men that fall in love at first sight because they're attracted to beauty. Men initiate, women respond. So it's a subject-object relationship of love and beauty. So there are these differences. But then how are these differences distributed? So it's not that all women are like that and all men are like that. It's like I don't know, some kind of curve. I can't remember what it's called. And so the average woman is like that, and the average man is like that. And some men are really masculine, and some women are really feminine. But also, there are lots of men who have many feminine characteristics, and lots of women have many male characteristics. And if you look at this male over here, even though he's a man with XY, in reality, he's more female-like than most males, and in fact, maybe more feminine than the majority of women. This female over here may be more male-like than most females, and maybe even more male than the majority of males, or more masculine than the majority of males. And that's what we notice. We notice it inside ourselves. We notice it inside other people. Just as the principle says, within every man, there's a feminine aspect. Within every woman, there's a masculine aspect. So the principle understanding of nature reality actually fits with this. that's the principle. Understanding of that's the way reality is. Everybody has within themselves these dual characteristics, and it's like a spectrum. Anyway, there are these, problem is, that's the way it is, but in reality, often people have these sort of stereotypes. People like to draw things up into these columns, just like Pythagoras. Everybody's like, either you're in this column or you're in that column. And so it leads to the creation of certain gender stereotypes, about women are like this and men are like that. Whereas in reality, it's not like that at all. In reality, it's much more like this. And so the principal view of the nature of reality fits with this, and it doesn't go along with that kind of table. Again, this is different opinions. Which gender or men or women are better at the following professions? Percentage I think men are, percentage I think women are. And again, you can see this sort of, this. But in reality, even in a country like Sweden, you find most women tend to form in these kind of professions, and most men tend to form into these kind of professions. So even when people have the opportunity where there's no, when they're pushed to do the opposite, they often fall into these kind of things. And so the problem is that's very controversial. Man and woman, one is that, one is the other. Okay, but people's views have been changing. This is a British Social Attitude Survey. So if you look over the last, I don't know, what is that, last 35 years or something, there's people's views about agree a man's job is to earn money, a woman's job is to look after the home and family. So you can see way back when, that's what a lot of people thought, but that proportion has declined considerably. Disagree about that. That's also changed a lot. So people's views about gender roles has changed a lot over the years. And so you get little pictures like that. So if we look at this then and look, what is gender? I'm not an expert on this. I'm just trying to figure these things out as much as I'm sure all of you are. So, as I often say to people, I don't expect you to believe everything I say or agree with everything I say. I'm just, but just trying to help to create some kind of framework for thinking about these kind of issues. So what is gender? It's a state of being male or female, typically used with reference to social, cultural differences rather than biological ones. Okay, so there's different aspects here. I think I sent out, or you should have received an article, which I think explores this issue quite nicely. So one aspect is our body, so our biological sex, our experience of our own body and how our society genders the body, what kind of clothes are expected to wear, etc., and how others interact with us based on our body. And so you'll know yourself, how you dress, how you make yourself up, how you do your hair, all these things, people react and respond to you differently depending upon how they perceive your physical body and physical appearance. That's like that aspect. And either one's XX or XY, you can't change that. But then another aspect is our identity, our deeply held internal sense of self as male, female, a blend of both or neither, who we are internally know ourselves to be. So that's something that every single individual, as they're growing up, they start to figure these things out. What sort of things they like, what sort of things they don't like. Some are more masculine, some men are more masculine, some men are more feminine, and vice versa. And then there's also the expression, ways that people express their gender, how we present our gender to the world, and how society, culture, community, and family perceive, interact with, and try to shape our gender. So a lot of that is going on. So a lot of it, biological sex, that's fixed. You can't change that. A lot of stuff is our biology, our physiology, the way we see things and all that. There's that aspect which we work on. And there's also, people encouraged to behave in a certain kind of way if they're male or female. So gender expressions are also related to gender roles and how society uses those roles to try and force conformity to current gender norms. So social and cultural expectations. So this is where it becomes problematic. This is it's not problematic here or here, This is where it becomes problematic, when people try to enforce social and cultural expectations upon people. That women are expected to behave in a certain way, or men are expected to behave in a certain way, then it becomes problematic. And part of the reason is because the world in which you live is a fallen world. Yeah. And so often these social cultural expectations are fallen, as well as being incredibly oppressive, based upon the idea, well, this is the way it is, so this is the way it ought to be. You ought to fit in with the social and cultural expectations based upon your gender. So gender development, gender identity is a sense of oneself as male or female, and this sense of self develops in a series of stages. It's like a self-discovery. Gender stereotypes are culturally defined expectations about sexes which begin developing early in life, but become more extensive as children grow older. So basically, I think it's really important then that the sense of self develops in a series of stages. So I think it's really important that children should be allowed to develop that and explore that for themselves. It becomes really problematic when people try to impose certain kind of categories on them. And that's increasingly the case now, that people are told, oh, you like doing this, therefore maybe you are a girl, not a boy. Or you like doing that, or maybe you're actually a boy and not a girl. So there's a lot of that sort of stuff going on today, where teachers and other people have been encouraged to impose certain kind of concepts upon people. Anyway, the fallen culture we live in, because of the fall, the patriarchy, fallen culture leads to fallen gender stereotypes. So again, that's very much going back to Pythagoras again, one side oppressing the other. So the idea there's a right way of being a man or a right way of being a woman, this all comes back again to Plato's ideal forms. There's an ideal form of a woman, an ideal form of a man, and people are expected to conform to that ideal form. Yeah, and that ideal form then becomes expressed in the fallen world. Women are expected to do this, and men are expected to do that. So a lot of the stuff, it goes all the way back to this idea of ideal forms. And of course, Plato's ideal forms themselves are based upon the fallen world. So this is something, I haven't got the quote here, who it's from, but this is what I found quite useful, interesting. Lack of understanding regarding distribution of sex-related personality and behavioral differences has led to confusion that impacts children who fall at the extreme tail ends of the distribution. And so if there's a boy who has quite a lot of feminine character, then he might think, oh, maybe I'm really a girl trapped in a boy's body. And at the other thing, there may be girls who feel they're quite masculine in character. They may feel, because of what they're told, oh, I'm a boy trapped in a girl's body. So there's a lot of confusion. People often aren't aware of this, this graph, yeah, that there's a lot of interaction. Just because you have a lot of what you regard as masculine characteristics doesn't mean you're a man, or if you've got a lot of feminine characteristics doesn't mean that you're a girl or a woman. The fact is, no child is actually born in the wrong body. Adults should expand their understanding of what normal male and female behavior and preferences look like, which would lead them to appreciate that being male and female comes with a wider range of personality preferences and possibilities than old stereotypes would have us believe. So it's the problem is often with this old stereotypes, the old binary opposites. And people don't feel, I don't fit into this, I don't feel I fit into that category. And that, I think, causes a lot of problems. And so that's what people are reacting against when they say, I don't fit into that. I don't fit into that stereotype. Okay, so let's have a look again. It's always good to have a bit of facts. This is the Integrated Household Survey. It's a survey done by one particular branch of the British government. They have a census and they do surveys every year. And this is one of the questions they ask people. They ask, so I think, about 100,000 people or something. They do a survey. And so you can see here how people self-identify. This is how people self-identify. And this is all anonymous, yeah? It's all anonymously they self-identify. And so about 94, 93% of people self-identify as being heterosexual. Then in terms of people who self-identify as being gay or lesbian, again, it's around about 1%. just over 1% nowadays. And the proportion of people who self-identify as being bisexual, it's less than 1%. And people who self-identify as something other than that, it's about 0.5% at the most. And then about 4% of people either don't know because they don't feel like they fit into any of these categories, or they just don't want to answer the question. So we can see here, this is just the way it is. Yeah? And so then so the government then wanted to analyze this a little bit more, what's going on here in this particular category, which adds up to 2.5%. So they analyzed the 2.5% and to see how it's distributed. So of the 2.5%, 61% identified as gay or lesbian. A quarter of the 2.5% identified as bisexual, and a smaller number identified as pansexual. I'm not sure what that is. 2% of the 2.5% identified as asexual, which means they don't feel like they're male or female, and they don't feel attracted to male or female. There's no sense of attraction, and no sexual attraction either way, or identity. And 1% of the 2.5% identified as queer. So 13% of the respondents, so 13% of the 2.5% were transgender or trans. And of the total sample, of the 2.5%, nearly 7% were non-binary. They identify as having a gender that was neither exclusively male or female. 3.5% of the 2.5% were trans women. They transitioned, nearly 3% of the trans men who transitioned from women to man. So when you look at the numbers here, the proportion of the population that self-identify as being trans, it's about, what's that, about 8%, no, 6.5% of 2.5%. So it's a tiny proportion of the population, very, very small. But when you listen to it in the media, you get the impression, well, maybe it's 10 or 20%, but actual proportions are tiny, microscopic. Yeah? And so this is something one should consider when passing legislation. Yeah. And so this is very shocking for a lot of people when these figures come out. So this was last year. This is an article in the Guardian newspaper, which is a liberal left newspaper in the UK, which is very promoting LGBTQ rights and everything like that. And so that's what they said, exactly that. And they said here, it actually comes to a shock to them, yeah, because that's not what they expect. And so again, this is another article a couple of years ago. The gender fluid generation, young people on being male, female, or non-binary. It talks about the gender fluid generation, but again, the gender fluid generation is about 2%. It's a very, very small proportion of the population. It's a very, very small proportion. Anyway, so these are the kind of things that you come across. How many genders are there? There's one particular website talked about, dozens of genders. I don't know what most of these mean, to be honest. But anyway, there are lots of, maybe half a dozen people identify one or two of these, I guess. And so this is Nigel Biggar. He's a Regius Professor of Moral and Pastoral Theology at the University of Oxford. He said, what I don't get is a demand that society should reform its language and census forms, reform its lavatories and sleeping arrangements around an ever-growing taxonomy of genders, which takes its bearings from stereotypes that have long been discredited. Yes. And says nothing new or vanishes into private obscurity. So, for example, we're told that non-binary describes any gender that transcends the accepted system of male and female. But beyond the one that feminism has already dismantled, what other system remains? Further, where exactly does the difference lie between bigender, combining male and female, and intergender, somewhere between them? And how do these amount to anything more than a feminist rejection of traditional stereotypes? And in the case of agender and aporagender, which supposedly transcend maleness, femaleness, and anything in between, what qualities are left to give them meaning? And so you can see here, it's kind of very, very problematic. You get this issue here, why should society reform its language on its census forms? Okay, in order to conform to the 2.5%. It's lavatories, etc. And so this then becomes a real problem in the real world. It's all very well in the world of academics and people just thinking and writing articles. But then people start translating all these ideas into reality. And this is what happens. This is Martina Navratilova, who's one of the greatest women tennis players. So the rules on trans athletes reward cheats and punish the innocent. Letting men compete as women, simply if they change their names and their hormones, is unfair, no matter how those athletes may throw their weight around. As a reality, although they're supposed to reduce their testosterone levels by a certain amount, if trans men who change their bodies into the body of a woman had the same level of testosterone that women have in their bodies, they would die, because you can't change the basic physiology of the chromosomal structure of the body. They would die. So that's the way it is. This is just a reality. Okay, so I can't stop. This is something I came across last year. I can't stop thinking about Viaghayagua Stowers, or rather a picture of the 18-year-old Samoan standing on the second step of a podium last week, looking stoic but sad. By any measure, Stowers is a remarkable woman. As a child, she's a victim of sexual violence and sought refuge at a victim support group, where she began weightlifting and went from being shy and hopeless, which are her words, to World Junior and Commonwealth Games champion. Yet having been chosen to be the flag bearer at the Pacific Games, she missed out on 2 gold medals to a 41-year-old Laurel Hubbard, who looks set to be one of the biggest stories of Tokyo 2020. That's the Tokyo Olympic Games, which is supposed to happen this year. The reason? Hubbard is a transgender athlete who is a male named Gavin, did not make a ripple on the international stage until becoming a woman in her mid-30s. Now, though, Hubbard is a realistic contender for an Olympic medal and creating a tsunami of protests from women who fear she has an unfair advantage because of the residual benefits of being a male. As the Australian weightlifter Deborah Atkinson put it, I feel that if it's not even, why are we even doing the sport? Yeah, that's the whole point. And then it's the same with trans, men who think they're women, who enter boxing, who enter judo, who enter martial arts and compete. A huge problem there for the women. And then this is not only affecting that, but it's also affecting our freedom of speech. So there was a tax expert who, anyway, this is a test case, this is in the UK, again last year I think. There's no legal right to question whether a transgender person is a man or a woman, an employment tribunal has ruled. Maya Forstater, 45, lost her job as a tax expert at the Center for Global Development in March this year, after she's accused of publishing offensive tweets questioning government proposals to allow people to self-identify as the opposite sex. So she's accused of publishing offensive tweets, so she's not even allowed to disagree with government proposals and criticize them. A legal dispute against a former employer was seen as a test case on whether gender-critical view, meaning a belief that there are only 2 biological sexes, is a protected philosophical belief under the 2010 Equalities Act. So the question is, are you actually allowed to believe that there are only 2 biological sexes? No. However, in a landmark judgment published yesterday, the employment judge, Taylor, decided Mrs. Forrester's view is incompatible with human dignity and fundamental rights of others. Judge Taylor concluded if a person has transitioned from male to female and has a gender recognition certificate, that person is legally a woman. That is not something Mrs. Forrester is entitled to ignore. Her position is that even if a trans woman has GRC, she cannot honestly describe herself as a woman. That belief is not worthy of respect in a democratic society. So here you're having the shutting down of opinions. It's newspeak all over again. Yeah, these kind of views are unacceptable, and so people are not allowed to say them. they're not even allowed to think them. Even paying due regard to the qualified right of freedom of expression, people cannot expect to be protected if their core belief involves violating others' dignity and creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating, or offensive environment for them. And again, this is something going on in America this year. Some teenage girls, teenagers at school. So trans girls condemn discrimination as families of 3 cis girls, that means women living in women's bodies, claim unfairness in a federal case. So the families of 3 female high school runners filed a federal lawsuit seeking to block transgender athletes in Connecticut from participating in girls' sport. Selena Soul, a senior at Glastonbury High School, and another high school, are represented by the conservative not-for-profit organization Alliance Defending Freedom. They argue that allowing trans athletes to compete has deprived them of track titles and scholarship opportunities. Mentally and physically, we know the outcome before the race even starts, said Smith, who's a daughter of former Major League pitcher Lee Smith. The biological unfairness doesn't go away because of what someone believes about gender identity. All girls deserve the chance to compete on a level playing field. So what do you do about this? This is a girl, 13 years old, and this is going on in Britain at the moment. So a schoolgirl who's 13, she forces the council to scrap transgender toilets plan in schools, which said that pupils should be able to use whichever bathroom they prefer. So again, this is the Oxford City Council, County Council. They sent instructions to all schools that children can decide what gender they are. So if there are boys that self-identify as girls, then teenage boys who self-identify as girls are allowed to go into the female changing rooms, undress in front of all the other girls who would also be undressing in front of her, inverted commas, and the same with girls who think they're boys can go and do the same in boys' bathrooms and toilets and changing rooms. And so this girl, she says that's, as she said here, she said this threatened her safety, her privacy, and her dignity when she wanted to go to the toilet. It meant that if a child born as a boy said they identify as a girl, they could be allowed to use girls' toilets and changing rooms. So again, she's a 13-year-old, but she's taking the council to court. And she won the case, and the council had to withdraw that advice. But this is, you know, these are the kind of real issues that are going on. And, you know, so it's really very, very problematic where we're going here. So when we're addressing this issue, one has to recognize that every single human being is a son or daughter of God. Every single human being is a child of God. Every single human being has divine, unique, individual, and eternal value. So, you know, if somebody is struggling with the issue, are they over their gender, then one should have compassion for them. And one should love them and care for them, you know, because this is, you know, they obviously, they're sons and daughters of God. And I can't imagine anything worse than to be going through this kind of struggle within oneself. But at the same time, the question is, well, should the whole of society be reorientated to conform to this, everything conforms to this 2.5% and their particular needs and desires? Or should things like toilets and changing rooms, should it all be catered for the 95% majority? And then people who struggle to fit into one of these, okay, maybe you can have a separate place. But is it right that the 95% should have to conform everything and change everything so it conforms with the wishes and the views of, you know, the 2.5%? So these are all kinds of, you know, very difficult issues that which are coming up all the time at the moment. And so I think when we look at that, you know, the problem is people are rejecting binary opposites because what they're rejecting is the Pythagoras' view. But at the same time, you know, society needs to change to recognize actually the way that women have been treated in the past has been bad. But at the same time, not to just say, well, there are no binaries. There are no dual characteristics. Everything is entirely arbitrary. And that becomes a real problem because then everything becomes quite meaningless in many ways. So, you know, women then have to think about, well, what's the future then of women's organizations? Why do women set up their own organizations? There's a very good reason why women set up their own organizations. Why are there women's shelters where women go to escape from domestic violence? And why do women who go to women's shelters, why are only women allowed to work in those shelters? Again, they're very good reasons. What about women's prisons? Why are women's prisons historically always been separate to men's prisons? Very good reasons. I don't think any women would like to be in a mixed prison because it's very obvious what's going to happen there. Women's changing rooms. Do we want to continue to allow women's changing rooms, or we just want to make it, okay, let's make all changing rooms mixed, essentially? What about women's swimming, women's sports? You know, you think about women's swimming, okay. But what about Muslim women? They can't go swimming in a swimming pool, there are men. And so Muslims have made arrangements with local swimming pools such that during a certain period of the week, for a certain amount of time, only women will be allowed to go into the swimming pool and in the building itself. So if we change that and say, okay, we will allow men who think they're women into the women's swimming pool, how's that going to affect Muslim women? What about women's sport, wrestling, boxing, all these sorts of things? So this is a huge issue, really, I would say, for women and for the feminist movement. The feminists generally seem to have been poleaxed by the trans and been intimidated by men claiming to be women. And then this other issue of gay marriage I'm not going to look at today. I'll look at that on Monday. These are serious issues. I'm not claiming I have the answer, but these are the kind of issues that are sweeping through our society today. And I think a lot of it is because of this fallen categorization of the nature of reality, which comes from Pythagoras, which has dominated our culture and society. People have rejected that, rightly so, but they haven't found an alternative way of describing the nature of reality, which does recognize equality and the value and the complementarity of masculine and feminine, and that one isn't supposed to oppress and dominate the other. So I'm not claiming to have the answer. I'm just trying to point out some of the problems here and some of the issues, and also where some of these problems arise or where they come from.
Oh, dearest Heavenly Parent, thank you for this day. Thank you for gathering us all together here and listen to Unification's Divine Principle viewpoint on our nature of reality. Thank you for our lecturer, William, who made a huge investment and work to prepare all this information for us. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to study the truth, be with you, and come closer to your heart and your love. Thank you for guiding us, being with us. Thank you for trusting us and loving more and more each day. Thank you for supporting us on our journey in our life. Your truth and love help us to overcome all the obstacles and barriers and become free in our heart, free to love, free to forgive, and free to embrace each other. Forgive us all our shortcomings, and thank you for your loving, forgiving heart. And bless all the participants here and their families. And I pray in the name of my frame of central blessed family. Aju.
Aju. Okay, thank you very much. I'll see you on Monday. Hope you all have a good weekend. God bless you and your families, and if you can get out, have a nice time together.
Yeah.
See you next week.